This is College Matters from the Chronicle.
So arguments for tenure that rest on the idea that tenure protects or at least makes possible academic freedom are, I think, fundamentally disadvantaged in the current political climate. Dismantling academic freedom is the end goal. It's not an unfortunate consequence.
In the contentious politics of higher education, few issues arouse such fervent debate as the faculty employment protection system known as tenure. And there's plenty of debate around it today. Just last week, Oklahoma's Republican governor issued an executive order barring most of the state's public colleges from granting tenure. Governor J. Kevin Stitt's order was yet another clear signal that the tenure system's days may be numbered, particularly in red states. For its supporters, tenure is a necessary contractual guarantee, giving professors the right to teach and publish on controversial topics without fear of dismissal. But critics have long charged that tenure amounts to a job for life, leaving faculty virtually unaccountable for their performance or behavior. So, is tenure a lost cause? My guest, Deepa Das Acevedo, wrestles with this issue in her recent book, The War on Tenure. Deepa is an associate professor of law at Emory University, where she teaches about employment regulation, among other areas. Deepa, welcome to College Matters.
Thank you so much for having me, Jack.
So, Deepa, I wanted to talk to you about tenure because I feel like it's very much under threat right now. There have been calls to fire professors, as you know, over comments that they've made about hot-button issues like Charlie Kirk or Israel. And critics see tenure as the thing standing in the way of that kind of discipline. Does this feel to you like a particularly precarious moment for tenure?
I think that a lot of what we've been experiencing over the last few years, first of all, is not that new. One of the first things I discovered when I was beginning my research on academic employment practices and tenure is that, every 20 to 25 years or so, there seems to be this wave of concern over tenure and higher ed employment and practices within the academy. And I think we're in one of those cycles at a heightened level right now. I think a second thing, though, is that there's been this growing sense, I think from both directions, from within the academy and from outside, that there's just really a lot of distance and misunderstanding and ungenerous characterizations flowing in both directions. And I think that the conversation really has ceased to be one. I think that we need to change that. I think we need to find a language to talk about academia, about education, about academic labor practices, which is what I'm primarily interested in, that is intelligible across the aisle. And we haven't really done that very much.
Yeah, you come at this from a different perspective. You study employment law, right?
Yes, exactly. I'm also an anthropologist, but within law, my primary area of specialization is labor and employment law.
And a tenured professor, so presumably you can tell me whatever the heck you want.
Well, I started this research before I got tenure, so it was kind of, there was a little bit of anticipatory PTSD.
Well, I think there is, as you said, a lot of confusion about what is and what isn't tenure. Let's start simply. Enlighten me. What is tenure?
So tenure is a variety of just cause employment contract. But to explain what just cause is, I need to go a step backwards. The default rule for indefinite employment relationships in the United States. So these are relationships where you start not expecting to have a term of employment. I'm going to work for this person for 2 years or 5 years or so on. The default rule for indefinite employment relationships in the United States is called the at-will rule of employment. And that means that either party can terminate the relationship for good reason, bad reason, or no reason at all, anything except a specifically illegal reason, with no notice and no payment in lieu of notice. So I like to say that, if you're an employee, you could go to work and under the at-will rule, your boss could say, "It's Thursday, you're fired. You're wearing blue, I hate blue, you're fired." Just cause contracts act against this at-will rule by saying your employer needs to have just or reasonable cause to terminate the relationship. They can't fire you for no reason or bad reason. And tenure is a variety of this kind of just cause employment. There are lots of other employees who are kind of the beneficiaries of the heightened job security that just cause contracts provide. Government employees, for instance, state and local employees, especially federal employees, once they get past the probationary period. And we've been seeing a lot of the fallout of just cause contracts in the federal workforce being terminated. Orchestra musicians, interestingly enough, are another type of employee who are the beneficiaries of just cause job security. Anyone who is employed pursuant to a union collective bargaining agreement. So although tenure is a variety of just cause, there are a lot of other workers, other employees in this country who also have just cause contracts and the heightened job security that they provide.
And that's a distinction that I think is important for us to draw, because I think some people look at tenure as this super special, uber privileged class. And as you've pointed out, that's not entirely true. There are other workers in this country who have similar types of job security, but that's the exception. Far and away, most people in this country are at-will employees, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's hard to come up with firm numbers, but I've done some back of the envelope calculations with some friends of mine who work in employment law policy, and I've also seen other people's estimates. And I think it's safe to say about 75 to 80% of the U.S. workforce is at will, which means 75 to 80% of the U.S. workforce can walk into work one day and be fired because they're wearing blue and their boss hates blue. Right? So tenure definitely provides a really valuable benefit in the form of job security.
Why should it be different for tenured professors?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where academics have kind of really fallen down on the job, because the answer to that question is always because academic freedom. And I think that there has to be something that's more easily legible to non-academics, something that speaks to concerns that are not unique to academia. And there are at least two things that I think are really worth pointing out here. First, academia is surprisingly difficult and risky as an industry to get into. There are high barriers to entry. You have to spend 6 to 8, maybe 10 years just getting the baseline credential, the doctorate that most disciplines require of potential professors. That degree takes a long time, which means you're not earning money, which means you're not saving for retirement or a kid's college fund. It also makes you incur a lot of educational debt. Academics hold a disproportionate amount of educational debt. Even if you actually get that job, and we've talked, Jack, about how there's like maybe a 10 to 20% chance of getting the job that you've spent all of this money and all of this time and foregone all of these opportunities for. Even if you get that job, the job is surprisingly low paying. You know, one of the things that I did was to compare data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics on what somebody who has a doctorate in a specific discipline could earn in the general workforce versus what they would likely earn as a tenure stream professor. And in many disciplines, they just don't add up. So you're spending a lot of time, a lot of money to have a chance at getting this job that you will statistically be unlikely to get. And even if you get that job, you're going to earn less at it than you probably could have earned in the general workforce with the same credential. Now, it doesn't make sense to go into that kind of industry. One of the few things that makes academia as a career choice and an industry somewhat sensible is the promise of job security. If you jump through all those hoops and you make all of those sacrifices, academia provides job security.
Yeah, so high barrier to entry, high cost, but high societal value.
Exactly.
So you're going to add an extra incentive for people to participate in that.
So that's the first reason. I think the second reason is that the things that academics are rightly expected to do, teaching and research first and foremost, they operate on extremely long timelines. What that means is that if your job is vulnerable to termination at any given point in the year, the way it would be if you were an at-will employee, or even if it was only guaranteed for 2 years or 5 years at a time, you simply can't do the work that you are supposed to be doing. Research, whether it's social science or lab science, takes a lot of time. You have to develop projects, go out into the field or stay in the lab, spend months collecting information, analyze the information, and then synthesize and explain it via publications. That can't happen quickly, but if your job can end quickly, you're in trouble. You're probably not going to do that work.
All of this makes sort of intuitive sense to me, Deepa. But I do feel like we're in one of those moments where these arguments don't seem to be resonating strongly, particularly in red states, I feel like. I think a lot of laymen look at this and say, oh, you really want academic freedom so you can teach about hot button topics, whether it's LGBTQ issues or CRT or this, that, and the other. That has historically been an argument. We need people to be able to write and think about things, even if they're sensitive in our political culture, and we want them to be able to do it, and they need to be able to do it without fear or favor. Ergo, we need some kind of additional protection.
And I agree with all of that. I'm sympathetic to it. But I think the problem is that the dismantling of academic freedom is the desired outcome of this war on tenure and on academia more broadly. It's not a negative consequence that somebody involved in promulgating this war might want to avoid. So arguments for tenure that rest on the idea that tenure protects or at least makes possible academic freedom are, I think, fundamentally disadvantaged in the current political climate. Dismantling academic freedom is the end goal. It's not an unfortunate consequence. What I'm trying to do with a more employment, labor-oriented approach to academia and to tenure is to say, actually, a lot of the concerns that you might have about how tenure affects faculty behavior or faculty incentives are unproven or inaccurate. Actually, a lot of what tenure does is facilitate the kinds of behaviors, the kinds of outcomes that you, looking from the outside in at academia, might want. And I hope that's a more legible argument for people who aren't coming at this issue from within higher education.
Right. And I think it is a highly politicized issue. We saw hundreds of people who were disciplined or fired across all industries, but certainly higher education, after Charlie Kirk's killing. I want to ask you about a notable case that maybe we can drill into a little bit. This is a tenured professor at Austin Peay State University who was fired after posting on Facebook something that was seen as critical of Kirk after his death. It was actually a Newsweek headline that read, Charlie Kirk says gun deaths, quote, unfortunately worth it to keep Second Amendment. This was a big story that was widely covered across the country and the world. The university's president summarily fired this professor over email, saying it was because of the post. I'm highlighting this case, number one, because it involved a tenured professor, but it was also overturned. So it's an interesting case in which, this professor, Darren Michael, was awarded $500,000, got his job back. What does this case tell us about the protections of tenure? How might it have played out differently for an untenured professor?
There would have been absolutely no chance. I rarely speak in absolutes in this way, but there would have been no chance that the professor in question would have been reinstated if they had been untenured. What the Austin Peay case really shows us is one of tenure's great benefits or value adds to the person who holds it, as well as to the institution and society at large, which is the creation of due process rights at the institutional level. Because Darren Michael was a tenured professor, he was entitled to certain processes of hearing, notification, evaluation, discussion, and so on before the university took that kind of drastic action against him. And as you said, they summarily fired him. So he didn't receive that due process that tenure guaranteed him, whereas a non-tenure track professor or, mind you, a pre-tenure, tenure stream professor even, is not entitled to the same kind of process guarantees that a tenured faculty is. I actually have a project in the works arguing that the post-Charlie Kirk terminations really showed us why the doctrinal legal framework for adjudicating workplace speech disputes in public employment generally and at many universities, which have kind of adopted a version of the First Amendment for their internal disputes, even when they're private universities, why that doctrinal framework is broken. And I think the other thing that the post-Kirk firings really showed us is that academic labor concerns are not as unique, as distinct from general workforce concerns as both academics and non-academics tend to assume. You know, when Maura Finkelstein was fired by Muhlenberg College within the last 2 years, I think the public reaction was, academia is full of left-leaning snowflakes and they want special rights.
Tell us a little bit about that case, Deepa, for folks who don't remember it.
Absolutely. So Maura Finkelstein was a tenured anthropologist at Muhlenberg College in Pennsylvania who was terminated within the last 2 years. I forget the exact date that everything wrapped up, for social media posts pertaining to the Israel-Palestine conflict. There's a lot more detail in there, but when Maura was ultimately terminated, there was some news coverage saying, you know, this is the first tenured professor to have been fired over comments relating to Gaza. And I think a lot of the general media and chatter reaction to that was, look, this is another instance of a left-leaning professor wanting special rights that most of us don't get and don't expect. But then, in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination, as you noted, the terminations transcended industry, geography, political climate, and everyone seemed surprised that this could happen. I think the 140 to 150 employees who were terminated because of their Kirk-related postings really represented a watershed moment, showing us that a lot of the things that academics have been experiencing or saying about their labor conditions are similar to the concerns and preferences and desires that non-academic employees also have, and vice versa. We're not so far apart.
And just to close the loop on the Finkelstein case, she was terminated, she appealed, but that initial appeal was denied. The American Association of University Professors investigated her case. They said the college violated Dr. Finkelstein's academic freedom, but she's not been reinstated as far as I know, right?
She has not been reinstated at Muhlenberg. The separation is complete.
Stick around. We'll be back in a minute. If you're trying to keep up with new academic books, you already know the problem. There's more coming out than anyone can possibly read. That's why New Books Network is the best resource for scholars and deep readers to keep up with new research and writing in their field. New Books Network is a massive collection of long-form interviews with scholars and authors, almost 30,000 conversations on the site across history, politics, literature, science, you name it. You'll hear directly from the authors who lay out their arguments and research methods. New Books Network also works closely with academic publishers, including partnerships with Princeton University Press, Oxford University Press, and MIT Press. So it's a great way to stay current with the kinds of books that shape actual conversations in higher ed. If you want a smart, efficient way to discover books worth taking seriously, go to newbooksnetwork.com. That's newbooksnetwork.com. So I think part of the backlash we see against tenure is that some folks look at behaviors for which tenured professors keep their jobs and think, if I were in a corporate setting, surely I would have been fired over this. One of the things that I think your book does so sharply is you really take head on a lot of the historic arguments against tenure. I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about that. What do you see as the main reasons people articulate a problem for this, and what did your research show you about the merits of those arguments?
So the three main stereotypes that I usually encounter particularly, but not only from non-academics, about how tenure affects professorial incentives and behaviors are that tenure incentivizes professors to be iconoclastic, predatorial, or just plain lazy. And while I understand these worries, all of these are saying that immense job security leads to bad behaviors along various types. I also think that there are problems with each one of those stereotypes.
Yeah, you really drill down in your book into reasons for that. But let's just take one of these, the notion that professors are lazy because they get tenure. Oh, I finally completed this. Now I don't have to do squat anymore. Does your research show you any merit to that?
Really, no. And this is possibly the one that personally irritates me the most because it often comes from within academia as much as it comes from outside. Everyone is willing to say, well, Bob down the hall hasn't published anything since the Reagan administration, so clearly tenure incentivizes laziness. And the number of non-academics who think that, if you're a professor, you only work the 3 to 4 hours a week that you're actually in front of a classroom, if in fact you even stand in front of a classroom, is atrocious. But basically what my research has shown is that there are very few studies that actually examine academic productivity and the extent to which tenure changes it for the worse. Most of these studies actually refute the assumption that getting more job security by getting tenure actually causes people to become lazier and produce less or teach worse or anything of the sort that we might characterize as lower productivity. An important insight from this literature is that academic productivity, particularly in terms of publication, which is what we're most often talking about in this conversation, changes in terms of the outputs that it generates over time. So in a lot of disciplines, particularly within the humanities and social sciences, but not limited to them, you start off publishing a lot of articles and maybe the occasional book in order to get tenure, in order to get promotion. But as you go further along in your career, you are more likely to produce books instead of articles. Now, books, obviously, for most of us, take longer to produce. So you produce fewer of them. Does that mean that you're being less productive? Not necessarily at all.
I can see the productivity argument in two ways. It's human nature to think, oh, somebody might just take their foot off the gas once they attain this status because they think they're not going to get fired. Another way of looking at it is somebody spent 20 years, publishing their butt off to get to this point. They're probably not going to undergo a massive character and cultural change just because they've gotten this job promotion. So I can see both arguments, but let me get a little conspiratorial with you, Deepa. So you said there's not really much research that's looking at productivity before and after tenure. You've essentially dismantled most of the common arguments against tenure. You've got a dog in the fight. You're a tenured professor. Someone might say, of course there are no studies that show this. Of course Deepa says this isn't true. Do you think you can be objective about this?
So I think one thing to keep in mind is that nobody who's really been a part of this debate so far, whether you are critiquing tenure or supporting it, has no vested interests in the outcome of the debate. The criticisms of tenure and of academia are coming from politicians and public commentators who are actively interested in dismantling academia and academic freedom. They have interests too. And by the way, they have a lot less data than I do. So I will absolutely agree that I am not objective because I'm interested in translating and explaining an industry, a universe, a type of worker about whom there has been surprisingly little evidence-based analysis and conversation so far.
You have a great line in your book, Deepa, that kind of speaks to this. You said, most people are for or against tenure, depending on whether they think it produces renegades or heroes. It's so well stated. Speak on what you mean about that.
Academics and non-academics alike exaggerate what exactly a contractual relationship on a piece of paper, or let's face it, a PDF that's emailed to you, can do to the person receiving it. I think that academics tend to stress the positive and say that tenure allows professors to become heroes, to become stewards of democracy, to become completely disinterested with respect to their own conditions of work and to focus only on the pursuit of truth and critical analysis and the next generation. And I think critics of tenure focus only on the negative. They say that receiving that PDF that's been emailed to you by the Board of Trustees on a Tuesday morning is going to suddenly encourage you to unleash all of these highly iconoclastic and unverified non-scientific interests and perspectives that you've been guarding close for the past 10 to 15 years. It's going to encourage
Now you can say all sorts of obnoxious, ridiculous things and no one can fire you for it, right?
And I think that that's what I'm trying to get at with that line, which is that both sides are inflating what happens that moment that you get tenure, for positive or negative.
And I think people who have problems with this system, Deepa, will say, all right, let's not do away with this thing, but maybe we can make it just a little less than it is. And one flavor of that is post-tenure review. We see states that are trying to do this. We see institutions that are trying to do this. It's basically saying every 5 years or so, we're just going to check in and make sure you're still doing your job. And it usually does come with the possibility that you could be terminated at that point. Is that still tenure?
This is an opinion rather than a strictly legal argument.
Okay.
But I do not think that is tenure. I do not think that's even just cause employment, because just cause employment doesn't mean every year or every 3 years or every 5 years, I'm going to see if I can find a reason to fire you. That is not what just cause means. So fundamentally, I think that post-tenure review that comes with a real possibility of termination or severe punishment has eviscerated tenure and just cause employment more broadly. I think the other thing to keep in mind with post-tenure review is that it is not costless. It creates a mountain of work, what I think is largely busy work for the faculty and for the evaluators who are involved. You have people who have worked hard, trained for 6, 10, 12 years to get their jobs, then spent another at least 6 to 7 years to get tenure, and now might have been in that tenured position for anywhere from a year to 20 years. And you're telling them you might lose that job. They are going to put together every last document they can find in order to convince you that they should get to keep their jobs, which means you need to read it. You need to evaluate it. It's a lot of work.
And one of the interesting things you did in your research, Deepa, was to look at the terminations of tenured professors. Tell me a little bit about the trends you found there.
Yeah, so the tenured termination study is based on an original national data set that spans 20 years from 2000 to roughly 2021 and looks at every 4-year institution of higher education, which I generally call universities for ease of conversation. And I combed legal databases, news databases, campus newspapers.
A little publication called the Chronicle of Higher Education.
Exactly. And I put together what I think is actually a remarkably exhaustive database of all of the individual for-cause terminations that have happened at 4-year institutions in the last 20 years. So the kind of incidents that are covered in the tenure terminations data set are instances where a tenured professor has been fired for cause, meaning the university alleges that they did something that was bad enough to warrant termination, and the relationship has been completely severed. So it's like a post-mortem database.
And what did you find about how professors get fired with tenure?
Obviously, if you provide adequate cause for termination based on your own behavior, if you provide individual cause for termination, you can be fired. And that's what my tenure terminations data set primarily concerns itself with. But what's often underappreciated is that the vast majority of tenured job loss, tenured professors losing their jobs, doesn't occur because they did something bad or because they did something that their university thinks is bad. It occurs because of what are called reductions in force, RIFs. RIFs mostly happen when there is some kind of fiscal emergency at a university or college. So this happened a lot during the height of the COVID pandemic. We saw departments closing down or firing groups of faculty. Most of those faculty were non-tenure stream. They were not eligible to receive tenure or hadn't received tenure. But a surprising number of them actually were tenured or tenure stream.
Yeah. So if there's a fiscal emergency, all bets are off.
Pretty much.
So we know tenure doesn't protect you in a financial emergency. What about firings for cause, though? Are tenured professors ever getting fired for poor performance or wrongdoing?
So I've been parsing the data through a series of articles over the last couple of years, but by far and away, the most common reason that tenured professors get fired, according to the universities, this is the university narrative of why the termination happened, is that the professor in question engaged in some form of sexual misconduct. This accounts for almost 76% of the tenured relationships in the data set. It's not a good finding, right?
Right. I think that's interesting and notable. On the other hand, somebody might look at this and say, well, people rarely get fired with tenure over something like bad teaching or productivity. Is that surprising to you? Should we care about that?
I think it was surprising to me how bad the skew was towards sexual misconduct in the database. I expected something above 50%, but I did not expect over 3/4. I think that these comparative arguments about how the tenure termination status set reflects the behavior of tenured faculty and the effects of tenure have to be pursued with a great deal of caution because we don't have much information about how these things work in the general labor force. We don't know how often people get fired from a standard office job because they just weren't cutting it. And we also know that a lot of people get kept in their positions despite repeatedly not cutting it at work.
Big picture, though, part of me wonders if this conversation is moot. You say that the chances of landing a tenure job in your field are something like 10 or 25%, I think was your conclusion. And yet we still see people entering graduate programs, pursuing PhDs, thinking they'll be the exception, and working in untenured jobs. Has the horse already left the barn? Will tenure die of its own weight, regardless of what kind of conversation you and I are having?
So I think that the changes that are going to happen, in a way, have already happened. You know, these transformations began not in this moment because of this political climate, but 10, 20, 30 years ago because of a multitude of factors. And to some degree, you're right. Tenure is a vanishingly rare opportunity for the vast majority of aspiring academics, and it's only going to become rarer. If 10 to 20% of people who want to become professors actually become tenure stream professors, then that number is only going to get smaller. Higher education has been operating on a model that is fundamentally antithetical to the goals that it's pursuing. You have classroom instructors operating on an insecure economic labor basis, cobbling together jobs, driving between campuses, trying to eke out a living wage. And I think that is starting to show in the experience students and parents and society in general are having with higher education.
This is interesting. So it's unambiguously bad for the professors, and you're saying we're going to start seeing the downstream effects of that.
I think we're already seeing the downstream effects of that. I think when students say it's difficult to get office hours appointments with my professor. Why? Because they've already left for the campus across the city because they have to teach another class. It's difficult to just walk into my professor's office and have a conversation about life and my career plans. Why? Because that professor is holed up in front of their computer trying to publish another 3 articles or so. And these are all manifestations of the labor insecurity and the growing expectations of academia that have been unfolding for decades now. So even if tenure qua tenure, under that name, under the exact structure that we currently know it, becomes increasingly rare as a part of our academic labor landscape. Job security and the way it allows professors to do their work well will never cease being relevant, and I think will have to increasingly be part of the conversation so that we can get higher ed back on track, doing the core things that everyone thinks professors should be doing, teaching and research.
Well stated. I think that one of the things that you've kind of get at in your book and in this conversation is that both sides come to this argument with some pretty deeply held preconceived notions about it, which makes it hard for things to change. People are pretty dug in. We should have tenure. We shouldn't have tenure. Is there a third option? Is there a way forward?
My concern is with the conditions that make academic work possible. And I think those conditions have to include a heightened level of job security. I am not as fixated on the word tenure, but I gather that a lot of other people, both from the pro-tenure side and the anti-tenure side, are fixated on this word tenure. I think what we need to do is consider the functions, the practices, the dynamics that we are trying to create. Consider the type of job security that is actually necessary to promote those functions and practices, and then go from there, whether or not it's called tenure.
Well, you articulate a possible way forward, and we'll have to keep monitoring it to see what happens. But Deepa, thank you so much for coming and talking to us about this complicated and contentious topic. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on the show, Jack.
College Matters from the Chronicle is a production of the Chronicle of Higher Education, the nation's leading independent newsroom covering colleges. If you like the show, please leave us a review or invite a friend to listen. And remember to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast so that you never miss an episode. You can find an archive of every episode, all of our show notes, and much more at chronicle.com/College Matters. If you like, drop us a note at collegematters@chronicle.com. We are produced by Rococo Punch. Our Chronicle producer is Fernanda Zamudio Suarez. Our podcast artwork is by Cottrell Thomas. Special thanks to our colleagues Brock Reed, Sarah Brown, Carmen Mendoza, Ron Coddington, Joshua Hatch, and all of the people at the Chronicle who make this show possible. I'm Jack Stripling. Thanks for listening.